Welcome, everybody. My name is Jackie Jacob. I am at the University of Kentucky, and I am the coordinator for the small and backyard flocks at E-Extension, and I put on these monthly webinars. This month's webinar is on feeds and feeding with Justin Fowler, who's from Texas, completed his bachelor's and PhD degrees at Texas A&M, and has been working at the University of Georgia now since 2015 as an extension specialist in poultry nutrition. He is currently researching the relationship between chickens and their feed with the goal of improving nutrient utilization. All yours, Justin. I will be monitoring the Q&A, and if there are any questions relevant to what you're talking about, I will pipe up. Otherwise, I'll wait till the end of the presentation for questions.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. And thank you, Mark. Also, thank y'all for attending. So this presentation that I've have for us today, I want to go through both the understanding how a bird obtains its nutrients. So that's something we need to take into account, as well as what needs to be there in that diet. So sort of start with a picture like this, just to show that we have genetic selection. Either, we're in the modern industry, which I work with the University of Georgia, people who are in the industry. We have significant changes between broilers from the 1950s and broilers from today. But even if you're working with more heritage type breeds, they're still significantly different from what birds would have looked like, the original jungle fowl from the wilds of, Southeast Asia. That there's been a lot of changes related to both natural selection as well as, us sort of selecting birds to no longer be dual purpose breeds, but to have layers and to have meat type producers. And that has a lot of an effect on both their behavior as well as, how they produce for us. And so there's two components I want us to go through today. And it's really tied to the fact that the job of the diet or of the nutrition that we provide needs to do one of two things. It really needs to fuel that genetic potential, and it's going to do that in both the gastrointestinal tract, which we'll sort of walk through first, and sort of see how the feed that's consumed, how do we get it out of the feed and get it into the chicken where it's able to use it, as well as take a look through those 6 key nutrient classes, which is the reason we need our animals to eat feed. It's going to get these 6 key nutrients. What are the ingredients we get them from? What do those nutrients do? And so we'll walk through those two things. So genes, when we talk about genetic selection, what strain of bird do you have? We're really talking about life's instructions to make proteins. So that's what genes are. They're just basically, an instruction booklet for how things get arranged. So corn has its own set of instruction booklet that describes how it arranges nutrients to make it be corn. Chickens have their own set of instruction booklets that takes basically the same 6 building blocks, but makes them be arranged as a chicken. Humans, likewise. So I like to think of nutrients as sort of like Legos. So I like to think of chickens as sort of these Lego building creatures. There needs to be a certain amount of materials that meet the instructions available when the instructions call for them. And when they're there, we're able to, either build the muscle, we're able to lay the egg, we're able to meet the needs of the genetics as they're calling for them. So what we want to call sort of our Lego bricks, what we want to call our individual building blocks, whether they're in corn, whether they're in a chicken, no matter where they are, they break down into 6 groups. And these are our 6 nutrients. So every living thing requires some degree of these 6 things. There's proteins and fats and carbohydrates. So these are highlighted in our top 3. And that's because these are the ones that provide energy. These are the ones they need the most of. So there are 10 essential amino acids. So the reason animals need protein is they need, some of these essential amino acids to build their muscles. In the case of birds, they need to build an egg, they need to build feathers. These are things that require protein, as well as fats. So they are able to make quite a bit of fat, but there are some essential fatty acids that are needed. Carbohydrates, we need glucose. That's that primary source of energy for pretty much every cell in the body, is using glucose as a carbohydrate for energy. And then there's also vitamins and minerals and water. So vitamins for poultry just look about the same as vitamins for humans. If you were to take, your multivitamin and look on the back of the label, you're going to see pretty much the same things. There's vitamin A, D, E, and K. There's a lot of B complex vitamins. And these are required in small amounts for chemical reactions. So they're counted there as a nutrient, as well as minerals, some calcium, phosphorus, sodium, chloride. These are just elements on the periodic table. There's about 11 of them that are essential. And these count as our required building blocks for making a chicken, making an egg. And then water. So water isn't easily thought of, as a nutrient, but it's our most important one. And so we'll go through, these 6 here later on after we talk a bit about the GI tract. Because I want to start at the GI tract because that's where the bird is getting these nutrients from. So these nutrients exist in nature, right? Corn has protein, fat, carbohydrate, vitamins, minerals, and water. Wheat has proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and water. But how does the bird get it from the environment, from the outside world, from that corn, from that wheat, from that, whatever it's pecking at the ground or whatever it's pecking at its feed tray? How does it get it into its body and turn it into chicken or turn it into eggs, right? We need to break these building blocks apart so that the bird can reassemble them into the thing that we want it to do. And it's the GI tract. So the GI tract has 5 key goals, and they are to collect and break down food particles, right? So we're eating corn, but we don't want corn at the back end. We want an egg. We want a chicken sandwich. So we need to collect first and then break down these food particles, solubilize them, get them going in some sort of soluble solution so that they can be absorbed in the GI tract, so that they can be available for the bird to do something different with them, right? We're now sort of taking the Lego bricks, breaking them apart so that we can reassemble them. Another one is to provide a desirable environment for microbes. So simply bacteria are going to live everywhere. They live in the environment, they live in us, they live in chickens. And so we want there to be a desirable environment for microbes to live here in this GI tract to avoid illness. Also, maintaining water balance is important. So that second goal was to solubilize the food nutrients, but that requires water. And water is a very valuable resource. It's one of our 6 nutrients. It's also a very valuable resource. So we want to be able to maintain the water balance. We don't want to lose all of the water out of the GI tract, which is something like what diarrhea causes. It's an imbalance in this water balance. And then also dispose of fecal waste. So simply put, not everything that's eaten can be digested, can be absorbed, or even is useful. There are some things that are simply waste products, and the GI tract needs to be able to dispose of that waste. So we'll sort of flow through the GI tract, pretending like we were a bit of feed that was consumed, and we start here at the mouth. So this is really where nutrition starts. It's taking materials from the outside environment. It's taking a bit of seed grain. It's taking a bit of a feed. It's taking a bug, a bit of whatever they're able to peck at, and getting it into the body. Birds are unique among animals in that they don't have teeth. So millions of years ago, birds, chicken ancestors simply survived better when they weren't spending lots of time on the ground chewing up their food. So birds don't have teeth. And that is where a pelleted feed helps, especially for meat-type birds, because these animals are used to being able to look at and find and peck these larger particle sizes. That's easier to get into the mouth and immediately swallow. And so that's one of the benefits of being able to pellet a diet, is it helps this fact that birds don't have teeth and their mouth has to grab and peck feed that way. Once they swallow it, we enter basically what looks like the same stomach as our stomach. They have sort of the stomach that secretes acid and secretes digestive enzymes. They also have a very companion organ right after this stomach called the ventriculus, or the gizzard. And this is the replacement of their teeth. So the job of teeth in mammals, like we chew our food, or in reptiles, they're able to chew food. You break it down into smaller particle sizes. The gizzard does that job. It's just a massive muscle that chews on food. And so if you sort of take from here at the mouth to here at the gizzard, you see we've met these first two goals of the gastrointestinal tract. We are collecting food particles in the mouth, breaking them down either through acid and enzymes in the stomach, or through the gizzard being able to chew them up and break them down into smaller particle sizes so that they're able to be solubilized. Because that's now the goal of the later half of the GI tract, is to take these nutrients that were in the food, get them into the chicken so that they can use them. So now we've begun at the beginning here of the small intestine to do this real work of digestion. So the pH here is immediately increased. So it's acidic there in the stomach. The stomach is a very low pH, lots of acid, because they're trying to break apart these chemical bonds. We're trying to take things and make them into smaller pieces. But once you get into the small intestine, we now need to start getting things absorbable. And so the digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates like amylase or sucrase, the lipases and other things that break apart and solubilize fats, plus all of the protein degrading enzymes like trypsin, chymotrypsin. These things are also proteins, and so they would be deactivated if the pH were very low. So once things sort of leave the gizzard, the pH is buffered by the pancreas, things are getting solubilized now. And this is really what we call like the real work of digestion. Things are getting ready to be absorbed once you leave this part. So you get into the bulk of the small intestine, which is the jejunum and the ileum. So the small intestine sort of divided into two parts, but it's one long, chain of intestines. And they have these intestinal villi, which are there to absorb those building blocks, those Lego bricks. So they've gone through, the proventriculus, where there's lots of acid. They've gone through the gizzard, where they're being chewed up by the muscles. They've reached through the duodenum, where the pancreas is just putting out enzymes that are breaking pieces down into smaller and smaller chemical pieces. And now's the time to absorb them. And this is where, feed maybe spends an hour or two here. And if we're able to get any nutrients out, we need to get them out here at this point. And so the intestines have a very high surface area. You can see in this picture here, this sort of folding nature of it, that there's these fingers that then have fingers on them. This is very high surface area for absorption. In fact, if you were to take the small intestine of a chicken and sort of unfold all of these villi fingers and all of this surface area and lay it out like a flat sheet, you would have about the surface area of a tennis court. So as if you'd imagine the surface area of a tennis court, that's what's all folded up and placed into the small intestine of a chicken. And so this is basically the barrier between the animal and the outside world. So the skin is the obvious barrier, both for us and for birds. We think of as that's the barrier between outside and inside. But really, the highest surface area contact point between outside and inside is here at this single layer of cells that are in the gastrointestinal tract. And so because of that, it's also a very high contact point for microbes, for things that might be pathogens. And so it's also the home to the largest number of immune cells. So the gut is also there for absorbing nutrients, as well as being one of the key immune organs for the body. So once they've gone through the intestines, hopefully everything that's useful, all of our protein and all of our carbohydrates and all of our minerals and vitamins, they've been absorbed, because at this point, we're now reaching the end of the small intestine, where things that are useful in the diet can have been absorbed. there are the ceca. So these are sort of similar to the appendix in humans, but they're these two blind pouches that exist basically between the colon or large intestine and what we were just talking about, the small intestine. And this sort of reaches, again, one of our goals, that third goal of the GI tract, and that's to provide a desirable environment for microbes. There's about 10 to the 11, so that's a 1 with 11 zeros. That number of bacteria live in each gram. So you take a little scoop, weighs about the weight of a paper clip. Take one of these scoops out of the ceca, there's 10 to the 11 bacteria that live there. So this is the most densely packed, the most diverse area for bacteria. They're simply going to live here. And so if this was an animal like a horse or even like cattle, we could use the fact that these bacteria can ferment and digest things to our benefit. Nutritionally, poultry aren't able to utilize the sort of digestion of fibers and the digestion of non-digestible things by these bacteria to any great extent. Because if you look here in this picture on the top right, the distance between the ceca, where the bacteria are living, and the end of the large intestine is very short. There's not a lot of room to get any nutritional benefit out of there. But the bacteria that do live in the ceca impact total animal health. So Clostridium, for example, which can cause a disease of necrotic enteritis, they live in the ceca. They live there all the time. But if there is damage to the upper small intestine, then they can move out of the ceca and cause a problem. So long as there's not damage to the ceca, the Clostridium live there quite happily, and it doesn't matter. And nutritionally, we don't consider the fermentation and the things of the bacteria that live in the ceca to have any great impact when it comes to our 6 key nutrient classes. So we're sort of leaving the GI tract now. This is our last chance for maybe water absorption, right? All this stuff has been very soluble, lots of water. Any electrolyte absorption, maybe some sodium or something is there that needs to be absorbed. But this is where, here at the end of the large intestine, where the digestive waste coming from our GI tract is being mixed with the kidney waste of the excess nitrogen and being voided out at the same time. So this meets our last 2 goals of the GI tract, where we want to maintain water balance. We don't want the contents of the large intestine that are coming out of the cloaca to have too much water, because that is a nutrient and we don't want to lose it there. But also then dispose of that fecal waste that includes the nitrogen waste from the kidneys, as well as any undigested things from the GI tract. And this here is the result of good digestion. Digestion goes the way it should go. There's some cecal droppings. That's that one there on the left, right? It's not overly frothy or gassy. It's got a dark brown color. It's not overly dark, like black, maybe like might contain blood and have some red to it. Same thing with the feces. They have some moisture to them. They're not overly dry, but there's not an evidence of excess water loss. See some white uric acid there on that. And that's the result of good digestion. That's what we should see if they were getting the most that they could get out of the feed that they ate. This would be the end product. If something is wrong, if there's bad digestion, if the gut isn't healthy, if the diet's not providing what they need, if there's not a good environment for microbes, if one of those 5 goals of the GI tract is not being met, now maybe the droppings are running. So that picture there on the right, that's essentially water with the uric acid. So the kidneys are fine. You see the white color coming from the uric acid, but the feces are quite moist. We're losing lots of that nutrient water. Also feed passage. You see there in the picture on the left that there's undigested corn particles in there. So those villi in the small intestine did not receive sufficiently broken down particles. So they weren't able to take the protein and the minerals and the vitamins that were in corn. They weren't able to take them and use them and get them into the chicken. They just passed right out, so they were lost. And so that is why poor digestion results in this poor feed conversion, wetter litter, maybe increased incidence of disease. So thinking back to our Lego bricks, are 6 nutrient classes: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and water. Let's walk through them a bit. And the way I want to sort of consider these 6 things is consider them like a recipe. So we want to make an egg, for example. Take this as an example. They're going to say a bird's going to lay an egg a day. So we take what they need to eat every day to what needs to be to making this egg. So it's 2 to 3 pounds of feed needed per every dozen eggs. But what is this recipe? Or what is this, if you had these sort of genetic instruction, you had this booklet and you had the genetic instructions. How do you construct an egg? How do you really build an egg? The first thing we're going to talk about is energy. So energy is measured in calories. So if you look on a food label, you'll see calories. That is a measure of energy. It's a measure used for heat. And so it's not quite easy to understand exactly how much energy that is. A calorie is the amount of heat required to increase a gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So that's not really easy for me to understand. Kind of like if someone tells me the distance to another city is X number of kilometers, I don't have a good idea of exactly how far that is. I'd like them to convert the units to miles for me. That would be easier for me to understand. And so we're going to do the same thing with energy and calories. Let's think of calories instead of heat. Let's convert them to joules. So that's the reason Isaac Newton is there in the top right, is that if an apple, average size apple, 102 grams, whatever, that's the medium size apple you might find at the grocery store. If it were to fall 1 meter, so that's about 3 feet, right? And so that's why Isaac Newton is there. He's sitting under the tree. The apple falls about 3 feet, hits him on the head. It releases 1 joule of energy. And so a food calorie, when we see a calorie on a food label for feed or a food label for people, that's a kilocalorie. That's 4,184 apples falling out of the tree. So if we take something like a can of soda, that's 627,600 apples falling out of the tree. That's about the weight of an Abrams tank. That's the amount of energy that's in the calories in the sugars and in the things that are in a can of soda. That's also the amount of energy that's in a hand grenade, right? So this is, lots of energy is in food. It's not the fact that we don't explode when we open our can of soda and drink it is that living things are able to metabolize this energy and release it slowly. And that is the first need for any animal. It's for energy. Most of the dry matter in the feed is going to meet the energy requirement. And it basically breaks down into either energy they can retain for their muscle or fat development, or energy they're losing in heat production. Birds have a high body temperature. It's higher than humans even. But even humans, we're generating heat. We're hot creatures. We were warm-blooded. About 60% of the energy in the diet is going to this heat production. And it's that 40% left over that they're able to use to maintain themselves, to then maybe lay an egg a day or something like that. And energy balance is important. So there was a picture at the start, which a lot of people like to show. I even like showing it. Shows that difference in genetic difference, between 60 years ago and today. I can make the opposite picture just with feed. So these birds here were raised in the same time, hatched from the same flock, raised in the same room. So the genetic potential is the same. Those 60 years of genetic selection that has made a larger bird is in both of these sets of birds. The difference between number one, who looks like what a 4-week-old broiler should look like, and the others is an energy balance. Number one has a corn-soy-based diet. It's balanced with energy and protein like it should be for a 4-week-old broiler. 2, 3, and 4 were basically fed corn only. So lots of energy is there, but there's not near enough protein. The vitamins and minerals aren't there. So the birds are there, they're alive. They have enough energy to survive, to maintain their life. But when the genetic potential, when the instructions called for some protein to build feathers or to build muscles, those pieces weren't available. And that's just like building your own Lego set. If your pieces aren't there, you can't construct it. And so that's why those birds don't look like their brother here on the left. And so the biggest component of any poultry diet goes to meeting the energy needs, and that's the carbohydrates, which come mainly from our cereal grains like corn or wheat. So looking here at predominantly corn, I mean, this is why it's our predominant grain, high energy. Protein is relatively fine, it's 7.6% protein. It's got a good amount of the sulfur amino acids for among other ingredients, but it's very high energy, 3,300 plus kcals. Sorghum is another common grain. You'll notice the energy just went down a little bit. So instead of maybe 3,300, it's 3,200, but protein went up, and that's the difference. So sorghum's maybe slightly higher protein, slightly less energy, but corn and sorghum are relatively equivalent grains when it comes to meeting the energy needs. Sorghum grows well in the south. You get to upper north latitudes, maybe wheat grows a little bit better. You might see more wheat. Start looking here at the differences in wheat. You see that energy value is much lower. It's about 300 calories per kilo less compared to corn, but the protein's much higher. So in places where you use more wheat, you do supply a slightly higher amount of protein. The difference, though, as well, though, is that carbohydrate fraction maybe contains more non-digestible carbohydrates in wheat. And so we'll talk about enzymes later, but something like a non-starch polysaccharide enzyme can help within the wheat, mainly because of this fiber content and the slightly lower energy compared to corn, which is mostly starch. But regardless of where they get it from, we're going to make this egg. We need about 300 calories per day. Next would be protein. These are sort of the building blocks of the body. So whether there are enzymes or these sorts of things which are regulatory or structural. So collagen and elastin, which make up our ligaments and our tendons and our circulatory system. Keratin, which makes up, for birds, it makes up their feathers and their beak. You know, these structural components, they are proteins. And the actual requirement is for individual amino acids, however. So we measure protein as crude protein. If you look on a feed tag, you'll see crude protein. But what that bird really needs are these individual amino acids. Now, what I find interesting about protein is how we're able to give it to these birds. So in the case of thinking about this egg, that bird needs about 18 grams of protein every day to make an egg. But we are able to get it from foods that we're not going to eat. So I like to maybe cook some food in soy oil, but I'm not going to eat the soybean meal. I like to maybe fill up my car with ethanol or something else from ethanol, but I don't want the dried distiller's grains that are left over. Meat and bone meal. You know, I like to eat poultry products, but there's a lot of meat and bone meal that's products that are left over. If I can make meat and bone meal, these are sources of nutrients that are there, that are available, that we would otherwise throw in the trash, lose them to the human food chain, if it weren't for the fact that we could feed these protein products back to poultry. And so if you're looking at soybean meal, now if you look at that energy value, that's about 1,000 calories less. Like, that's not meeting our energy source anymore. But look at that protein value, you're about 50% almost. You know, it's 46 to 48% protein from the soybean meal. So this is something that we've already extracted the soy oil. That's what humans wanted. That's what we had. This leftover part contains lots of nutrition that we don't want to lose. And why soybean meal is so common in animal feed diets, especially poultry diets, has to do with this other value here. So in parentheses is the digestibility coefficient. So that what that's saying is what percent is able to be taken out of the feed and absorbed into the bird. And with the example here of lysine, lysine is our key one. That's the one that soybean meal is sort of there for. It's not only very high in lysine, that 89% digestibility is higher than we'll see in any other protein source. So it's that key source of amino acids. So dried distiller's grains is another one. So this is basically taking corn and you let yeast digest all of the carbohydrates, turn it into ethanol. Well, what you've done, if you've removed carbohydrates, you've removed energy. But if you've removed carbohydrates and therefore energy, all you've done is make protein go up. And so you see, if you sort of compare corn to distiller's grains, energy's lower, but protein is higher. And that's sort of the balance that makes sense. But if you look there at that lysine value, it's high. It's higher than corn, but the digestibility is very low. Same thing with canola meal. That canola is growing in Georgia. Canola grows quite well in the northern latitudes also. It's common in the Canadian diets. Lysine is very comparable to soy. Soy was maybe 2.5, 2.6, 2 point, somewhere in there. You're at comparable levels of lysine. What's different is that digestibility value. So the digestibility of the lysine in soy, 89, 90%, is closer to 79 and 90% in other ingredients. But either way, they're needing about 18 grams of protein, highly digestible protein coming from these sort of byproduct meals. Fats are a storage form of energy. They improve the handling qualities of the feed. So even if you're feeding a layer who doesn't need loads of energy, 1%, 2% of a liquid fat still helps them, helps that diet be palatable, helps the birds want to consume more feed when it's hot outside and they don't maybe want to eat as much. And there are also these sort of recycled ways we're able to provide fat to birds. Poultry fat, again, that's that rendered byproduct like meat and bone meal from poultry processing. Animal vegetable blend type fats, those are coming from reused things from restaurant oils. Also, egg yolk color is influenced by the fats. So most of these coloring compounds come from fat-soluble things. So what a hen eats gets into her egg. So we sort of compared corn and sorghum, and I showed how they were basically nutritionally equivalent to each other. Maybe a little more energy in one place, a little more protein in the other. But they're nutritionally equivalent. But where they are not equivalent is when it comes to xanthophylls, these coloring pigments. So that egg on the left is a sorghum and soybean meal diet, and the egg on the right is a corn soybean meal diet. So nutritionally the same diet, so that means they're nutritionally the same egg, but you get a slightly different color, not for any other reason than the fact that sorghum doesn't have these xanthophylls. So these yellow, orange-colored pigments that come from other things. And these are fat-soluble, so they will end up in the egg. So if birds are eating things like grasses, even alfalfa, where there's some of these xanthophylls, or even in marigold petals, so in markets like Mexico and South America, where this color is very important, you will feed non-nutritional things like marigold petals to get this color because the color is desirable. But it's not a nutritional factor. But you need about 5 grams of fat a day coming from the diet to need to go into this egg, sort of to build our recipe. And then there are the vitamins, and then these are going to look the same, like I said, as the vitamins you'll see on your one a day, vitamin premix you might see for yourself. Vitamin A is used for vision and reproduction. Vitamin D is for bones and for calcium metabolism. Vitamin E is an antioxidant, so it helps promote cell integrity. It helps prevent disease. Vitamin K is needed for blood to clot appropriately. All of the B vitamins, they're water soluble, so we can run into deficiencies quite quickly. They're used for any sort of stress situation, any sort of energy transformation that's needed. Vitamin C you will not see in a poultry diet. So unlike humans, we have lost the ability to make our own vitamin C. So it's required from us to eat. Birds are still able to make their own vitamin C. It has been shown in cases maybe of an extreme stress, like a heat stress, that birds do okay with some supplemental vitamin C because they're not having to make it themselves, but it's not anything that's required for them. But other than that, these vitamins are going to look the same as the vitamins we would need for ourselves. And feed ingredients contain them naturally. So corn contains thiamine, corn contains riboflavin. Soybean meal contains fat-soluble vitamins. But what we do in the practical setting in terms of actually making a diet is just like what we would do with ourselves. I'll go to the drugstore. I'm going to buy a vitamin, one a day, and I'm going to take that in the morning. Now, the food I eat throughout the day is going to contain some vitamins, but I'm still going to take that one a day. And we try to do the same thing with poultry diets. We want to make sure we meet all of their needs with a premix for the vitamins and minerals. And then anything else there that's in the corn or the soybean or the wheat or the canola, we hope that is sort of there as extra, maybe as insurance, but we want to meet the whole goal with a premix. The minerals, there's 11 that are essential. That a lot of them tie down to structural components like calcium and phosphorus and magnesium. Those are in the bones. If you're laying eggs, calcium is in the eggs. There's the electrolytes that are needed in the blood to keep electrolyte balance, as well as these very small trace minerals, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, selenium, iodine. On a feed tag, you'll see these sort of things, like a zinc sulfate or something like that. And these are these very small micro minerals, which are needed in small amounts, but are still essential nutrients. These are one of our 6, Lego brick nutrient classes. Focusing just a bit on calcium and phosphorus, most of the phosphorus that's in a plant, so especially if you're, if you're a chicken and you're either having an all veggie fed diet or something where you're just grazing, most of the phosphorus that's in a plant is not available for the bird to use. They need supplemental phosphorus from an inorganic source. So the plant stores its phosphorus in this big phytic acid molecule. Lots of phosphorus is there. But when the villi in the small intestine, those little fingers, when they look for this, they don't recognize it. They're not able to absorb it. It's too big. They let it pass on by. All the phosphorus leaves. It ends up in the feces, and so it's not there for the bird. And so there is a need for supplemental inorganic phosphorus. So on a feed tag, you might see monodicalcium phosphate. A bone meal would work. Meat and bone meal, since it comes from bones, it's inorganic phosphorus. But plant phosphorus is not a very good source. But the ratio of calcium to this available or non-phytate phosphorus is about 2 to 1. And that's true for pretty much any bird species. For growing birds, you can about, as a rule of thumb, 1% calcium, 0.5% available phosphorus. And that amount might go down as the bird gets older. As they get to be a full-grown broiler, maybe they only need 0.85 instead of 1% calcium. But this 2 to 1 ratio stays about the same. The only case in which that's not true is laying birds. So birds who are laying eggs need extra calcium because there's calcium in eggs. They do not need extra phosphorus because there is no phosphorus in eggs. So they still need the same 2 to 1 ratio for their bones, but they just need extra calcium to make sure they have it available to produce an egg every day. And also varying particle size helps. So laying hens who are fed oyster shell, that oyster shell is a larger particle size. And if you remember the gizzard, when we went through our GI tract, the purpose of that gizzard is to chew up things, break them down into smaller pieces. So a larger particle size, like an oyster shell, spends more time in the gizzard. It might be available later into the evening, into the nighttime, when the bird is actually putting the shell on her egg, compared to something like limestone, which is a smaller particle size and gives calcium to the bird immediately. It spends no time in the gizzard, and it's available almost immediately. So it's about 4.5 grams of calcium every day. Again, it's good that it comes from differing particle sizes. Limestone's good for immediate calcium needs, but it's good to have a coarser grind, an oyster shell type source of calcium for later into the night and eggshell production. Finally, water. That was I sort of said I'd save it for the last, but it was our under thought of but most needed nutrient. About 10% of any feed is water, but the meat or the eggs we want to collect are about 3/4 water. So that difference needs to come from the drinking source. We can't rely on the feed to provide this. It's only about 10% moisture. And about every biological function needs water. So we can survive a huge loss in body fat or in muscle loss, but about a 10 to 20% loss in body water becomes fatal dehydration. So water is our most important nutrient. And there's lots of ways to lose it. Birds are losing it, through the feces. They aren't able to sweat, so they don't lose it through sweat. But what they do is pant. And panting evaporates moisture off the respiratory system. So they lose a lot through their exhaled gas. Eggs, like I said, eggs are about 65, 70% moisture. So that's a significant source. If you're laying an egg every day, every other day, that's a lot of water leaving the body every day, as well as just evaporation off the skin. In the case of heat stress, it's not only important for meat-type birds. Heat stress rediverts energy that should be going to growing to just maintaining body temperature. But I mention it here specifically because it can relate to laying birds, because as energy expenditure is going up, the bird is getting hotter, they're panting, maybe they're moving more. Birds also do this other thing where they consume less feed. So this is sort of like going into debt at your house, right? Money expended goes up while feed consumed or energy being brought in, your income is going down. So if expenditures go up while income is going down, you eventually reach this sort of point of bankruptcy. And so heat stress can become deadly quite quickly. Panting is this normal behavior that birds do. It's the similar thing to humans or mammals, and sweating. But in excess, what it does is all the CO2, all the carbon dioxide is leaving the body as the panting, as the respiration is increasing. It causes the way that the body buffers blood pH to change. And it uses carbonate molecules. So that's this one here at the bottom on the right. It uses this carbonate molecule to buffer blood pH. But if we're losing lots of CO2, that means all of that carbonate is going to sort of replace the CO2 that's being lost through panting. And it matters particularly to laying birds is that carbonate is also what's used to make the eggshell. So eggshell is calcium carbonate, and the carbonate comes from the blood. And so if the bird is panting in excess, it's losing this carbonate because of the panting process. That's less carbonate available to make a good egg. So they're not only eating less feed, they're eating less calcium. They're also panting and losing this carbonate. And so thinner eggshells and eventually less production can happen. But again, if we're going to build our recipe, water is that important component. So we have, about 300 calories. And again, it's interesting. There's not 300 calories in an egg. You see now that a lot of the energy going into making something like an egg needs to go into maintaining the animal. There's a lot of maintenance there. But about 18 grams of protein, 5 grams of fat, 4.5 grams of calcium, some vitamins and minerals as well, and about a cup of water. And that sort of is our recipe if we were to, build it or construct it like a Lego set. Just briefly here at the end, so basically once you put that in, you'll get an egg, right? If that is coming into the diet, from the diet, if the GI tract is healthy and able to absorb everything, it's going to get those amounts, then the bird will be able to produce, according to its genetic instructions. But just briefly here before we end, there's other things you might see in a diet, these non-nutritive feed additives that do impact either sort of the intestinal health and how we're able to get the nutrients out of the feed. Biggest one is, one of them is enzymes. So there's a lot of undigested feed components. I said, like we get fecal waste because there's things that are undigested. They can serve as food for gut bacteria, for example. So when I talked about wheat, I mentioned they might have, these arabinoxylans, these non-starch polysaccharides. These are non-digested carbohydrates. So they're in there in the carbohydrate fraction. They maybe contribute a little bit to the energy, but they're not as digested as well as something like starch, which corn is quite high in. And so maybe if it's a wheat-based diet, it would benefit from having some of these beta-glucanase or these non-starch polysaccharide enzymes. they break down these big, complicated looking, pictures of carbohydrates so that there's less there for the bacteria to eat on and more there for the chicken to consume. Undigested amino acids from maybe less digested protein meals. Maybe there's some meat and bone meal or something like that, or maybe the distiller's grains that didn't have highly digestible lysine. We don't want that lysine to go to feed bad bacteria. So something like a protease, an exogenous protease might help. Phytase is a big one that's pretty much universal in the industry. So that ties back to our, example of calcium and phosphorus, that most of the phosphorus in a plant is not available to the bird. So we can feed an enzyme, a phytase, and it will help break down this phytic acid that's found in plants so that the phosphorus is able to be absorbed by the chicken and doesn't go to waste and come out the back end and either end up in the feces or go to feed bacteria, something like that. So enzymes do help. Another one that's common is probiotics. Mainly they're these bacillus type species, Bacillus subtilis, lactobacillus, maybe bifidobacterium you might see in probiotics. What they do, the reason that they're added, why they work, is they do stabilize the microbiota population. As long as they're being fed, you have this sort of more stable environment in the ceca, where that was one of our 5 goals of the GI tract, is to have a stable gut environment for microbes. They also are able to compete with pathogenic bacteria for binding sites, like where they're going to live. So if the probiotic bacteria are living there, maybe something like salmonella doesn't have room to come in and live. As well as for nutrients. They're there, maybe consuming nutrients, the salmonella or the other E. coli or some sort of pathogenic bacteria aren't able to do so. Another feed additive you might see are prebiotics. So these are in that yeast cell wall. They're either yeast extracts or some sort of mannan oligosaccharides. What they do is principally they can prevent pathogenic bacteria like salmonella from binding to the intestine. So those bacteria like salmonella will instead bind to this yeast cell wall. They'll attach to the yeast cell wall and then they'll flow right out the back end. So they didn't adhere to the intestine. They didn't end up causing damage. These yeast cell wall type products also stimulate the immune system. They do things for the bird to help strengthen that gut health. Organic acids are another one. You might see maybe propionic acid. Butyric acid is probably a larger one you might see. It can be fed either in the feed or in the water. There is some direct effects on bacteria. These organic acids can disrupt the bacteria's homeostasis. They can change micro pH and do these sorts of things. But also, they help the intestinal cells themselves develop. So this serves kind of as an energy source for those villi cells in the small intestine. And so something like a cocci or something like another intestinal stress does less damage, maybe, in the presence of organic acids. And there's also essential oils. So some of these things, again, they might come from rosemary, or they might come from clove, or they might, come from cinnamon, or they might come from peppers and, this capsaicin. Some of them do have antibacterial effects. They can directly, kill or inhibit bacteria, but they also stimulate the secretion of digestive enzymes from the GI tract. So you might see things, essential oils, botanical type products. Source and purity of these do matter, and also really key, especially tied to the research I've done here at UGA, is into their coating and encapsulation. So when we went from the proventriculus gizzard and then went down into the duodenum and started the small intestine, I mentioned buffering. Buffering the pH is something that's really important right there at that barrier between the stomach and the small intestine. And that's highly regulated by the animal. Those digestive enzymes need a well-buffered pH. And so acidifying something up into the crop and up into the stomach will simply be buffered away by the time it reaches the small intestine. So that can greatly reduce the effectiveness of something like an organic acid, which needs to acidify something. And so they need to be encapsulated in some way. And that's why if you find most these feed additive products are going to have some sort of maybe a palm oil or maybe some sort of other, fat encapsulation so that it survives, getting through the stomach, down through the gizzard, before it's then released and can start acidifying conditions. But most people who use these find that a combination is the best approach. So like in the industry, you'll see maybe a phytase, some other sorts of enzymes in the feed. Maybe they might want to throw in an essential oil, and then you'll see maybe a butyric acid or some other organic acid in the water. There's some sort of combination of these. No one of them is, sort of doing all of the work. What poultry do, and the reason why I like to study them, the reason why this is my line of research, is they are able to take these unused sources of nutrients, especially when we come to those protein sources. We looked at things that were inedible ingredients to humans, but we were able to, using poultry, turn them into lean meat, turn them into nutritious eggs, and that's done only when we provide them with this balance of those 6 nutrients for what they need according to their genetics, balanced with their energy needs to sort of stay alive. And with that, I'll take any questions.
If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box or in the Q&A area. We have a few minutes left that Justin can answer your questions. And while you're thinking of them, I want to remind you of upcoming webinars. May's webinar is on poultry production over the decades. June 5th is the poultry behavior and how to read a flock. And July 10th is STEM, which is the science, technology, engineering, and math, and poultry, how to incorporate poultry into your science programs. Any questions? Must have done a really good job. Nobody's got any questions.
That's what I'll assume, yeah.
Yeah, that's the best way to assume it. Oh, somebody's got their hand up. What do I do with that, Mark?
Well, they probably hit that by mistake. The Q&A or the chat button is up there close to the hand raise, so there's not really anything that we would need to do with it.
Oh, okay.
Let's give them 30 seconds or so. Maybe they're typing in their question now. I'll add a note, folks. I'll put this. You probably got here via the Learn event, but I put it in chat anyways. Again, a link to the recording will be available at this Learn event within a few days.
And if you're not already, you can check us out on Facebook. Where we post our webinars, where we post when the recordings are available. And if you want to see fact sheets and other things on poultry or see the past webinars, you can do it with extension.org/poultry. I'm not seeing any questions. Brett, did you have a question? We have your hand as being up, but
so there's a question in Q&A there.
Oh, is it? Okay. Should we be feeding eggshells back to chickens?
There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Yeah, especially if they're ground up, particle size might matter. So an eggshell is quite large, but that's basically a source of calcium and carbonate. Mainly it's a source of calcium. You're not really going to be able to feed the carbonate from that, but there's nothing wrong with grinding it back up and feeding it back. Yeah.
I just find that it's best to dry it first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have a moisture part. They have a bit of protein still sort of stuck on there from the membrane and stuff, so it is good to dry it. And then particle size also matters, yeah.
Have a chicken have a chicken eating commercial feed, access to oyster shell, but continuous soft eggs? Somebody's having a problem.
Well, I guess it would depend on what's in that commercial feed. So I guess I'm a nutritionist, so don't ask me a broad question like that because I can ask you a bunch of questions back. But yeah, I mean, I guess a lot matters on what's in that commercial feed. And also it might come back to if they're under a heat stress situation or, what the rest of their environment is like to know why they might continually have soft eggs. Yeah. That's almost more questions than answers.
Yeah, you would need to know, are you feeding anything else besides the feed? We get a lot of people who say they're feeding commercial feed, but then they dilute it with corn. I get that a lot, or scratch grains.
Right.
Not really feeding it very well.
But access to oyster shell is nice. I think if oyster shell or a calcium source is available, laying hens they're smart enough, I guess. They're smarter than broilers. They're smart enough to find it if it's there. So that's good.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's more to ask than to answer from there.
It's not a simple nutrition question.
Right.
Okay, we have found that some chickens will crack their own eggs. Is this bad? The yolks, etc. In other words, egg eating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
they will. So they'll also be cannibalistic and things like that. So yeah, they will. Sometimes it's accidental. I mean, if the eggs aren't collected in a timely manner, they just maybe happen to break them. But if they become sort of aware that they're there, it is possible that they'll do that. That timely collection, I think, is the best way to sort of stop them from doing that.
I find that if they're doing a lot of egg eating, there's a nutritional deficiency of some sort.
Yeah, maybe.
As well. So whatever you're feeding, you have to be careful with.
Yeah.
I'm just answering these questions so that we have it on record.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any more questions? We are about 2 minutes left. And I think the key problem I see with small flocks is they buy a nice nutritious feed and then they dilute it by feeding an energy source. And I think your presentation did a good job of explaining why you need all of the things in a nice balance.
Yeah. Yeah, once you take a balanced diet and add an energy source, is you drive that picture that had the broiler with his brothers and sisters who were smaller, that were eating basically French fries, you drive them towards that side. So that's what those birds were eating. They were eating basically corn. Lots of energy, but less nutrition. So they were there. They made it to the picture day, and there they were. But at any time you take a balanced diet and add more grain, you add more energy, you dilute out nutrients, and you're going to drive your birds towards that direction. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Those birds were fine. They were happy, right? They were there. I took their picture. They looked quite pleased, but they didn't meet their genetic potential because there was not that balance between their energy and their nutrition. So you can constantly push them towards that smaller and smaller direction, but you lose out on meeting that genetic potential when you avoid that, when you disrupt that balance.
Right. Okay, our time is up. Thank you very much, Mark, for being our host, and I hope, Justin, that you had a good time presenting. It was a very good talk. I appreciate you coming and giving of your time, and we'll get the recording up as soon as possible and let everybody know where it is. And so until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.